Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to BNE Enterprise's Steering Your Business Through COVID-19 webinar. We welcome Rebecca Andrews, the Australian Industry Group Head of Queensland, into the discussion as moderator for this afternoon's session. We also have Gadens Lawyers Partner Jonathan Hadley, who's joining us to discuss employment contracts and EBAs, as well as John Nicolas, partner at Gadens Lawyers as well, to discuss retail and commercial leasing environment during the coronavirus crisis. Appreciate again everyone being here. Obviously, BNE Enterprise is navigating its way through this new Zoom technology, so I appreciate everyone's patience over the past week and a half. It's been a steep learning curve for the team here, and without further ado, I'll hand you over, Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Doug, and good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick update if you don't know who our group is. We're a peak employee organisation, so represent traditional and innovative and emerging industries. Doug and the Brisbane Airport Court team have asked me to provide a quick economic update for you today and then also moderate the session today. Normally when I do economic updates as part of our events or membership events that we hold, I try and start off with something that's a bit challenging at the front and then end on some sort of good news or good stats. But I don't think I need to tell anyone, who's involved in that meeting that we're in some pretty extraordinary times at the moment, and that the COVID-19 is affecting our lives, from how we work, how we live, how we travel, how we use Zoom, communicate, learning all these new technologies, and apparently to how much toilet paper that we all need. And myself personally, I'm involved in some state government PPE work, and I've never had as many conversations about hand sanitizer in my life. But as I said, it's challenging times. There's lots of heartbreaking stories out there, but there's also some good heartening things about how businesses, cafes are pivoting, are selling food online, are delivering those things, and how people are adapting their businesses to and services to survive. And I use the word survive because I'm not sure they're thriving, but they are surviving. So we at AR Group have a small internal economics team that provide regular research, data and updates to our members and to our partners, and we provide that into government. And there are an index on the manufacturing sector, an index on the construction sector, and an index of service industries. And I thought I would just go over the latest ones of those before talking about more broadly economic data that's out. So these are based in that 50 points indicates, results below indicate deteriorating business conditions, and obviously results above 50 indicate expanding business conditions. So we do these on a national level, but we also do break them down into each state. So for example, in the Queensland Manufacturing Index fell by 1 point to 38.1 points in March 2020, which is a fast rate of contraction. The Queensland Manufacturing Index has been falling. It was falling last year. However, in comparison to in Queensland Index, the Australian Manufacturing Index was absolutely up 9.4 points. And this was due mainly to the huge surge in demand for food, cleaning products and household essentials. So that's quite an interesting comparison. The services index, which is the retail sector, the hospitality sector, recreational personal services, that fell by 3.4 points to 43.9, again indicating a fast rate of contraction in those sectors. And in comparison, Queensland, which was, I said, was 43.9, the national average had gone down to 38.7 and actually contracted 8.3 points, which is the lowest result ever since we've been doing these since March 2009. So that's a big fall, and as we know, would reflect those hospitality, retail, service sectors. So we also do the construction sector, which is also in a very challenging position. It fell by 1.7 points to 30.4 points in Queensland, and this indicates a fast rate of contraction. In comparison, the Australian index fell nearly 5 points, and in worrying signs for us ahead, the March also showed a steep decline in the index for orders and contracts in the coming months. So this indicates there'll be a slower activity for building sites, and this is obviously due to the uncertainty and the outlook leading to future declines. We also do weekly updates for our members when we look at and all the surveys that have come out, specific information. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of those that I thought might be of interest to people in the webinar today. The federal government Department of Education, Skills and Employment, put out a survey saying 95% of businesses were negatively affected in some way by COVID-19 in the first 2 weeks in April. I mean, I don't think that would be of any surprise to people. And they actually estimated that 4% of all those businesses surveyed were currently in the process of actually closing down. So it was only 5% that indicated that they had no impact at all. And the ABS has separately estimated that around 10% of all Australian businesses with employees, so not self-employed, but businesses with employees, will not be operating, they predict, in early April. ABS data continue to point to our already unemployment rising. We've probably seen that in the media. The 6% fall in employment implies that there are 781,000 further people lost their jobs in the first 2 weeks of April. That's 240,000, a total of 30% of them were coming from the hospitality sector alone. We envisaged, and they envisaged, that these newly unemployed people and the continuation in the unemployment will see this rise from 5.2% in March to 10% in April. RBA Governor Philip Lowe gave a recent update on what the Reserve Bank thinks for the future. They're predicting GDP to drop to around 10% in the next quarter, by around 10%, sorry, in the next quarter. They're also saying that number of hours that we work will drop by about 20% as unemployment or underemployment or people reduce their hours in working. The national unemployment will rise to 10% and the cash rate will remain at 0.25%. They're saying for at least 2 to 3 years. And I kind of wanted to end, before I pass over to Jonathan, on just a couple of our own surveys from our own membership. A couple of things that I thought were interesting. 1 in 20 of our members have reduced staff numbers in the past month, whilst 2% have had to hire new staff. So that's a reasonably low figure. We have had 1 in 5, and this number is increasing, experience disruption to supply, freight, imports and costs. And I guess I wanted to sort of end on this figure because I think it goes to more beyond economic data, but also how we need to take care of each other. That more than 30% of our members are saying that there is increased anxiety and mental health pressures within their workforces due to COVID-19. So that's, whilst that's a startling stat, that's a reality that people are anxious about their job, they're anxious about the future, and that it's important that as we move forward that we take care of ourselves and others. So many of our members are in the manufacturing sector. They're saying that they're okay at this stage, but they are really fearful of the next 6 months as orders and contracts are reducing. So whilst tourism, retail, hospitality have immediate effects, other sectors are feeling this in a slower way and are saying this may be longer. So I did search to see if I could find a really great stat to end on that from economic. There has been some amazing uptakes in technologies and Zooms and the way we're changing things, but as you all know, it's a challenging environment. So I couldn't find anything uplifting, probably except things about how we're looking up things on the internet, or that there are some sectors that have grown due to our increase in spending or stockpiling, all those things that we all read about in the media. So I'm happy to take questions at the end when the session, if you have any questions about AI Group or broader about the economy. So right now I'm going to hand over to Jonathan. Jonathan Hadley, he's a partner in Gadens, and he's going to talk about new employment contracts and EBAs as in dealing with impacts of the coronavirus. Jonathan, I've got a lovely bio on you that I read out. We'll just hand straight over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rebecca. No, that's fine. Thank you very much. And I'm an employment partner, and obviously we're exceptionally busy. I also had a slide on Rebecca on a number of statistics, but I think you've covered most of them. The main statistic I wanted to show, which I think is on the next slide, is that we found that nearly half of businesses have had to change workforce arrangements as a result of COVID-19. And what we've found initially was obviously a mad rush on reducing working hours and changing where people worked, including from their home or standing down. There's a number of issues we had, which was also coupled by the fact of the schools being closed. And we're currently dealing with a number of large businesses on people working from home, but also dealing with some other situations in their lives. I don't want to go through too many statistics. I'll go on the next slide, which is a bit of a hot topic at the moment. And I also can have questions at the end. But effectively, most of you will be aware of the JobKeeper payment that is now currently flowing through from the government. And basically, the JobKeeper payment was announced by the Commonwealth Government to assist companies through this economic impacts. And what it does is it obviously provides a subsidy from the government for businesses to continue paying their employees. Most of you would know this, but it's worth going over that to be eligible, employers have to obviously have a drop in their revenue. With employers less than $1 billion having to have a reduction of 30%. Obviously, employers over $1 billion, they have to have a drop in 50%. But some of the issues that are coming out now is through eligible employees, and we've had the rules recently released by the Treasurer. But eligible people can claim a fortnightly payment of $1,500 before tax. For a maximum of 6 months on the basis that the employer pays those employees per fortnight. The subsidy started on 30th of March 2020 and goes to 27th of September. And what it basically means is that each eligible employee is guaranteed to receive the minimum $1,500 per fortnight. Unfortunately, though, what we're seeing though is the 500 out of the 900 businesses that have signed up, only 500 have taken this further. This is currently going to cost the government going forward $130 billion. One of the main changes out of the JobKeeper rules was it's an all-in policy, which basically means that all eligible employees are entitled to receive it. And what that is once an employer decides to participate, and as I said, 500,000 out of the 900,000 have decided to go forward. What it means is that all eligible employees that have nominated must receive the $1,500 per fortnight. And what that actually equates to is all eligible employees who are undertaking work for the employer or have been stood down may be eligible. In other words, the employer cannot select which eligible employees will participate, and it's imperative that if a business accepts the subsidy, they have to roll out the obligations to avoid any civil and criminal penalties. We're currently seeing at the moment some litigation that is already starting to flow from this, including a successful unfair dismissal claim. I'm happy to talk about JobKeeper after this, but I'll quickly go on to the next slide, which is the Enterprise Bargaining Agreements, which is the next one, yep. And basically, the Fair Work Commission has introduced new regulations that cut down notice periods and consultation periods required to give under enterprise agreements. Employers that were previously required to give at least 7 days notice of changes now are only required to give 1 day notice. Attorney General Christian Porter has said that this should allow employers the flexibility to ensure urgent and extreme changes are being met in shutdown circumstances. Even though the new regulations are set to expire also in 6 months, the changes should remain in place to ensure that employers can cope with the current pandemic. While the reduction in the notice period can assist in expediting the process, employers should still carefully consider any relevant factors such as variation to the employment contracts that sit underneath the EBAs. In this regard, there are a number of other issues that flow, including variation to hours as well as remuneration. On the flip side, on the next slide, there are some employers who have award employees, and those employees have also had the Fair Work Commission change 99 modern awards. In that regard, a 6-member full bench recently made a change on its own initiative to the 99 modern awards to give to temporarily give an estimated 4.4 million workers paid access to pandemic leave, access to 2 weeks unpaid pandemic leave to ensure that they're able to take the leave when necessary. The new provisions which came into the pandemic leave commence on 8th of April and will expire on the 30th of June. The full bench had said that in considering these measures, it was to provide capacity for employers to direct employers also to take annual leave and facilitate reductions in full-time and part-time employers' working hours. Continued that most provide for part-time employment also were allowed to make the changes. And while there is no impediment in awards to full-time employees reaching the agreement, the employers were allowed on most bases. So it leads me to the last thing, which was working from home. And the last point we're seeing is working from home policies. And this is something that has been a huge amount of work. The shutdown of Australian schools as a result also has seen a lot of workers working from home. We've found that a lot of the business weren't prepared for such a quick transaction, and as a result, we've had to work quickly to prepare the policies. Some important considerations that we have seen in working from home policies are an indication of start and finish times, are including that other policies also apply, such as drug and alcohol, are ensuring that a risk assessment of the employee's home is completed, and ensuring that there is appropriate IT help needed. We've found ourselves frequently advising and reviewing working from home policies, but we've also found that there are a number of issues that have now coming to a head. They include issues such as returning the employees back to the workplace, and we're finding that now employees are wanting to have policies to include that and deal with situations such as when a COVID-19 vaccination is made. We are currently advising on some return to work policies, such as what happens if an employee, due to their safety, doesn't want to return to work, and what happens if they refuse to accept a vaccination. These are some of the issues, and like I said, I'm happy to have questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Before I hand over to John, I'd just like to remind you, if you want to post a question, please do so. There's a Q&A, and it would be helpful for you to put specific questions forward and be an active participant in the webinar. So I'm going to hand over to John now, who's going to talk about retail and commercial leasing environment during the coronavirus. So thanks, John.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Good afternoon, everyone. Leasing, in addition to employee issues, has very much been at the forefront of this COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on business. Quite clearly, because most businesses' two major expenses are their workforce and their premises. And of course, there is a rush or a need to try and limit those expenses as best as businesses can. So what that has meant is, since the pandemic became much more of an issue in Australia in sort of early March, we saw a rush of businesses looking at their lease arrangements and trying to figure out what it meant for them. And what we saw in the initial stages was a lot of tenants looking at legal concepts of force majeure and frustration. I think we're now at a point where most tenants and landlords understand that those legal concepts probably don't play much of a part in dealing with the issue, and they've moved on. Interestingly, towards the end of March, we saw the Australian government form a view that they perhaps needed to protect some of our sovereign assets and sovereignty, and they changed some rules around foreign investment in real estate in Australia, quite often referred to as FIRB, Foreign Investment Review Board, approvals. Previously, FIRB approval would be needed for the purchase or leasing of property in Australia by a foreign entity where the value of the property was above a certain threshold. And that change, the change that was made was to bring it down to zero. And that obviously has a knock-on impact, which I'll talk about in a moment. Moving on from that, Scott Morrison and the National Cabinet, late March, early April, started to very much focus on what could be done in regards to people's leases. And through some machinations of various peak property industry groups and other lobby groups, National Cabinet ended up with a code of conduct that they announced on the 7th of April. They actually had the code in front of them on the 3rd of April, but it wasn't until the 7th that they met, and Scott Morrison subsequently announced it. I think collectively, landlords and tenants, whether they agreed with what the code provided for or thought it was fair or not, breathed a small sigh of relief, in the sense that there was perhaps going to be some certainty around how this could be dealt with. As I've said on the slide there, that code is to be implemented by legislation in each of the states and territories, and we'll have a look at a bit more of what the code says. But in terms of the implementation, what we're seeing is that not a lot of the state, territories and governments have been in a huge rush to implement it. In fact, the only state that has implemented it to a large extent is New South Wales. The other states and territories have passed what we call enabling legislation, which will allow them to pass legislation at a later time that actually gives effect to the code. So unfortunately, the certainty or degree of certainty created by the announcement of the code on the 7th of April has been eroded slightly by the fact that we haven't yet seen it come through in force in each of the states and territories. In terms of what we're hearing, so to give you some context, I'm in daily contact with the Shopping Centre Council, the Property Council, and then the Queensland Government about what's happening. To give you an idea of what we think is going to happen, the very clear direction from the National Cabinet is the code is not to be further limited in its application. So for tenants out there, that's good news. It will at least apply within the threshold that I'll explain to you shortly. Some of the other states are looking at applying it more broadly. So if you happen to have national operations, whether as a landlord or a tenant, we may well see some inconsistency state to state, which will make administration of the code across the country a little difficult. But it may mean in other states, as a tenant, you may actually get more than what you're going to get in New South Wales, because the New South Wales implementation is stuck fairly strongly to what the national code thresholds were. I'll briefly mention the land tax relief that's been announced in most of the states and territories. What we're seeing there is at least a 25% discount on land tax for the current year. And Queensland, for example, has announced not a discount, but a deferral of 25% of next year's liability to give people some further cash flow to use in what they're doing. All of that land tax relief, though, is predicated on landlords passing on the benefit of it to their tenants. Unfortunately, and again, it's probably us being lawyers, unfortunately, what's been announced is not legal in its nature. It's more policy or sort of motherhood type statements around what's trying to be achieved. I'm being told by the Queensland government they will not legislate for this. It is purely an announcement made by the Treasurer through a delegation that they have. We've asked Office of State Revenue to issue some sort of guidance note or public ruling on it, just to clarify what this passing on to tenants looks like. And what we're being told is it is not a direct passing on. So if there's a building with a number of tenants in it, what the government is not expecting is that the 25% saving that the landlord gets will then be shared proportionately on a floor area basis between the tenants. It could well be a situation where that 25% goes into the landlord's pot of money, and as long as the landlord fully exhausts that pot, however is agreed between the tenants to do that, then that will be sufficient to get the benefit of the land tax relief. So for the tenants out there, that may be some bad news. For the landlords, it is what it is. Ultimately, you've got that potential improvement to the pot of money that you can use. In terms of the FIRB issues, as I said, the threshold's now been dropped to zero. The we believe inadvertent consequence of that is any lease involving a tenant that is a foreign person, which is broadly defined, that has a term, including options that's likely to exceed 5 years, now requires FIRB approval. If you don't get the FIRB approval, then FIRB can in fact direct the tenant to divest themselves of the lease. In other words, they'll either have to agree to surrender or assign it to someone else. There are financial penalties involved as well. And the further and perhaps more immediate consequence is the application for approval has to be made by the tenant. Historically, it was a 45-day mandated response period. It is now increased to 6 months, which means any deals you're trying to do now, including deals where you're renegotiating rent and terms of leases in the context of the code, may well need up to 6 months to be approved by FIRB. And there are application fees applicable, which again, tenants will typically pay. It's not cheap. It's $2,000, where the total payments under the lease are less than 10 million. But in an industrial context, some of those leases do have high values, and the application fees move up in value fairly quickly from there. We suggested to government that this was an inadvertent consequence of what they were trying to achieve, which was what they essentially didn't want was foreign owners or foreign nations acquiring land in Australia at a cheap rate in distressed circumstances. We said to them that leases should probably not be captured, or certainly leases between a freehold landowner and a tenant in that sense. But they've not agreed with us. All they've said is that they are aware of the issue and they will move applications through as quickly as they can. So that 6 months may be shortened, but they're not committing to a time frame. They're just saying they'll do the best that they can. In a retail context, this has big problems. People recognise, for example, Country Road as an iconic Australian brand. It's foreign owned. So Country Road leases, David Jones leases, the Aldis of the world, Uniqlo, Zara, H&M. Any deals that you're trying to deal with those tenants now will now require FIRB approval. So that could have, a fairly significant impact in the retail sector. And as I said, I think it's an inadvertent consequence, but government's just not willing to back away from it now. So bear that in mind in any lease negotiations you're currently involved in, including renegotiation of terms pursuant to the code or as a result of COVID-19. In terms of the National Code and what was announced by the National Cabinet on the 7th of April, it's broadly aligned to the JobKeeper program. It refers to there being 2 tests. One is that the tenant is eligible for JobKeeper. So that word eligible, we believe, was deliberately used. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have applied for it or be receiving it, just that you're eligible for it. And the threshold there is a 30% or more drop in turnover, with turnover being based on reported turnover in business activity statements with a what we believe year-on-year comparison. It could be a month-to-month comparison. depending on how old the business is, how long it's been running, and what the conditions were in the previous year. But broadly speaking, it's a year-on-year comparison. The other applicable threshold is that the tenant have a turnover less than 50 million. That's dissimilar or inconsistent with JobKeeper, which has $1 billion turnover threshold. But when Scott Morrison announced the code, he was asked the question why that threshold was in place, and his view was anyone with a turnover higher than that is big enough and ugly enough to look after itself. An important clarification on that is if the tenant is a company within a group of companies, the turnover is at the group level, not at the individual tenant's level. So to the extent you're a landlord and you're being asked to give rent relief, you are entitled to ask for information about turnover, and tenants should expect to have to provide that. And if the tenant is part of a group, then that information will have to go to the group level, so that landlords can be satisfied that tenants are qualifying for the code to apply to them. There is another clarification relating to franchises, whereby if the premises are occupied by a franchisee, then it's the franchisee's turnover that's relevant, not the franchisor's, irrespective of who holds the lease. So bear that in mind where you are dealing with those franchise type arrangements. All of that being said, and as clear as that may seem to be, in the purpose of the code, there is what I call a vibe type statement. So for anyone that's old enough to remember the movie The Castle, I'm pretty sure Dennis DeNino has drafted this code, where it says that despite whatever the code may say, the principles of the code should nevertheless apply in spirit to all leasing arrangements for affected businesses, having fair regard to the size and financial structure of those businesses. This could potentially mean two things. Number one, that the code should apply in spirit to tenants with turnover in excess of 50 million, and or should apply in spirit to tenants that are suffering a drop in turnover less than 30%. A lot of tenants are out there arguing this point. Landlords are not sympathetic to the first argument of it should apply to businesses over 50 million. Most landlords perceive that as a bit of a try-on. That being said, if a big business such as a cinema, for example, is forced to close by order of government, that may be a different scenario. But where tenants have a turnover of more than 50 million, they're still operating, but yes, they may be suffering a downturn in turnover. Landlords are less sympathetic. Where we are seeing some sympathy from landlords is for tenants who are under the $50 million threshold that have suffered a drop in turnover less than 30%. Landlords are still potentially going to help those tenants out in the spirit of the code, but probably more so on a commercial basis, because they understand that they have a symbiotic relationship with tenants and need to work together to get through these sorts of scenarios. The code very much relies on parties agreeing terms. And what it says is that if parties can't agree to engage in this concept of binding mediation, unfortunately, much like the land tax relief, the code is drafted as a bit of a policy document. It's not drafted as a legal document, which means that this concept of binding mediation, which has no legal sort of definition or legal recognition, has caused a bit of an issue amongst landlords and tenants. The New South Wales implementation of the code does not adopt this binding mediation concept. It refers to mediation generally. And what we think the code was trying to achieve was a mandatory mediation process rather than this binding mediation process. Because in a mediation, the parties are there to try and agree an outcome. No one can actually bind them to a decision or bind them to an outcome that they don't agree to themselves. So again, it's going to be interesting to see what the states do with regards to this mediation issue. A bit further into what it says, how long it operates for. It's inconsistent in its language about how long it operates. It talks about it operating during the COVID-19 pandemic period. It then adds to that in some places a reasonable subsequent recovery period. And at the very end, it talks about it starting on a date after the 3rd of April and continuing whilst ever the JobKeeper program is operational. We think that more certainty is needed about that. Certainly New South Wales, in implementing the code, applied a 6-month period, starting from the 24th of April. We're seeing the other states and territories in their enabling legislation also providing for certain measures to be in place for fixed periods of time. So we're hoping that through the implementation in each of the states, this issue around what the period of application is will fall away. But I think it's probably fair to say it's at least 6 months that this code will be implemented in each of the states. The code provides for a moratorium on landlords terminating leases and or drawing on bank guarantees, personal guarantees, those sorts of securities have been provided. What is not clear is how to deal with pre-COVID issues. So if a tenant, for example, didn't pay their rent in November of last year, does this moratorium apply to prevent a landlord from taking action in relation to that pre-COVID default? The New South Wales legislation has provided some guidance on it, in that it says that the code or the provisions don't apply to non-COVID related issues. And I think we'll see that clarification come through in the other states and territories, because it is important. As for the rent relief to be provided, the National Code talks about a proportionality principle, and as best as I can explain it, it would be this: if a tenant has a 60% drop in turnover, then they are to be given rent relief equivalent to 60% of their rent during the relevant period. And that 60% is to be at least half waived rent, so you never ever have to pay it again as a tenant, and the remainder can be deferred, so that remainder would be paid off over a period of time. The deferrals are to be paid off over the longer of the remainder of the lease term, or 24 months. The obvious issue here is if you have lease expiring 12 months' time, but a tenant has 24 months to pay it off, there will be a period after lease expiry that the tenant's going to be expected to repay some money to the landlord. And that brings with it all sorts of issues around how do you secure the payment, can you hold on to the bank guarantee for that period, etc. The view that seems to be adopted by industry at the moment is that landlords will be entitled to retain bank guarantees and other security for that period to secure payment. But perhaps the more sensible solution may be to extend the lease until the end of whatever the payment period is. And in fact, tenants have the right to require that under the code. So we're seeing a lot of landlords taking a much broader view of this, and rather than just doing a deal strictly in accordance with the code, they are in fact doing much longer term deals, looking at higher proportions of waiver in exchange for a longer term deal with the rent increasing at a later point in time. So there is an opportunity out there for landlords and tenants to renegotiate deals and agree terms that are mutually sustainable and sensible. In terms of outgoings and how they're dealt with, any savings on outgoings are to be passed on. Again, it's not clear whether that's on a strict basis or whether at the end of the day, on a complete reconciliation of all the relief that's provided, they're getting the benefit of it. That's probably more towards where parties will get a better outcome. It says that if a tenant's not able to trade, so they've been forced to close, then outgoing should not be passed on. There's to be no interest or penalties on payments that are delayed. Landlords can't take adverse action against tenants who have reduced their trading hours or ceased trade or ceased operating in response to COVID, whether ordered by government or not. There's a real issue with that particular part of the code because it's in tension with one of the earlier principles that's not on the slide. And the earlier principle says that a tenant that wants the benefit of the code must comply with that lease, subject to any rent arrangements that are agreed pursuant to the code. And quite often, particularly in a retail context, there are provisions in the lease requiring the tenant to trade. And so what we're finding is landlords are struggling with whether or not they have to apply the code to a tenant who's not trading. And our view is, if the tenant is not trading but still paying some rent or all of the rent, then they all get the protection of the code. If a tenant, however, is refusing to pay rent and refusing to operate, then the tenant puts themselves in jeopardy of not having the code apply to them. And if the code doesn't apply, then the lease is enforceable within its terms, which means the landlord can in fact seek to recover full rent. So if you're a tenant, you want to be doing the right thing, or at least be seen to be doing the right thing, if you want to qualify for the code to apply to you. One other provision in the code is that rent increases are frozen. Again, there was a lack of clarity of exactly what that meant, but the industry seems to have gotten to a point where if a rent increase is due to occur during the period of operation of the code, then the rent increase would still be actioned. However, the landlords cannot charge the increase during the period of operation of the code. So if we have a rent increase in June, but the code goes until September, the increase will be actioned in June, but the increased rent cannot be charged until October, until after the code has ceased to apply. And of course, the following rent review will occur in June of next year as well. So there's not a postponement or deferral of the increases looking forward. I just wanted to point out that in going out with your landlord or a tenant and renegotiating lease terms or seeking to agree terms in accordance with the code, all of the usual rules relating to misleading, deceptive and unconscionable conduct apply. Why that is important is you can't, as a landlord, for example, go out and seek to renegotiate a lease and not give people time to think about it, or not make sure that people are understanding what you're putting in front of them. Likewise, from a tenant's perspective, if you're seeking rent relief, that's going to be on the basis of a drop in turnover. You need to be giving accurate records and accurate information. You can't deliberately or without prudent review of your records, give landlords information which paints a picture which perhaps gives a tenant a better outcome than would have been the case had accurate information been given. So it does go both ways. These conduct type laws do go both ways, and landlords would, for example, certainly be within their rights to take action against a tenant that deliberately misled the landlord to secure a better outcome in terms of the rent relief or other provisions of the code than otherwise. So what that means is take your time in doing these deals. I understand that there are pressures on both sides, but don't seek to have the other party respond to you in a manner that's too quick. Keep really good records of the communications you're having. Confirm in emails if you can. Beauty about these, smart devices is you can record voice memos if you want to. If you're not a typer or a handwriter, record a voice memo. And the important part of these sorts of records is they have to be as contemporaneous as possible. There's no point making the record next week of a conversation you had today. You want to make that record today, and as soon as as close as possible after the relevant communication or conversation. You might consider having other people involved. So if I'm having a conversation with a landlord and I'm a tenant, I might take Jonathan along with me as a witness to make sure that everyone's got the right picture. And in that scenario, both Jonathan and I would make our own notes of the conversation, and again, they will be contemporaneous. In terms of communications, it's always best to make them without prejudice and reserving your legal rights until you agree a concluded deal. And I think for both sides, everyone needs to be sensible in this. This is not something that is the making of either party involved. And there are pressures on all parties. It's not like anyone's making anything out of this or getting any sort of advantage. So be sensible and look for solutions that are mutually sustainable, because if one party gets the upper hand now, it may in fact make it unsustainable for the other party to continue for a period of time that may not reveal itself until later down the track. And if anyone falls over in this, then it's going to be to the detriment of the other party. All right, I think we're good to go for questions. Rebecca, have you got anything there?
John and Jonathan. There has been a question come through, so rather than me, I've got copious questions and notes here. I'll read that one out from Natalie, and she said, it states that Australian group level, so I'm presuming, as you were saying about the companies going up. What if they are overseas companies? Is it then the overall group level? So I presume.
If they are foreign companies, the view seems to be that they will not get the benefit of the code. We're seeing a little bit of divergence on that state to state, but New South Wales, for example, made it very clear it's got to be an Australian company, and other states have made similar clarifications. So if they're not Australian companies, as in Australian owned, then they're not going to get the benefit of the code. That's not to say that you shouldn't help those tenants out, but that's the view.
I was thinking that Natalie was meaning when you were saying that, now I'm trying to find it in your presentation.
I have an argument, I understand, but what I'm saying to you is if they are foreign owned, then they're not within the code, full stop.
Okay, all right, got you.
So you can negotiate whatever you want to with those sorts of tenants.
That's what Natalie meant, she said? Nope, that's what I meant, so all good. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Just keep them coming through via the chat or the Q&A. I'll just check. So I had a couple before, if nobody else has sort of got any online at this stage. So a question that we get asked in our group via our helpline is, what if people are refusing to come to work and they're not working from home? Can they receive the JobKeeper?
Yeah, so JobKeeper rules require that obviously people are paid for one. So look, stand downs have occurred, and recently the section that is commonly used in the Fair Work Act was actually used for inclement weather, but it's now probably held that it is the right provision to use. So if people aren't coming to work, obviously the reason is why aren't they coming to work? But the issue that you might have is when you give employers a reasonable direction and they say, well, I don't think it's safe. So they're using sort of the old Section 19 of the Workplace Health and Safety Act, saying that there's not a safe workplace being provided. But the main issue is, yes, you should be asking details from those employees. A lot of employees we find, for example, are scared of public transport. But at the end of the day, if you break down the reasons and you work that out, you separate that from JobKeeper. And JobKeeper is effectively that they have to be paid, and then once you get their nomination form, you register, they get paid, you get reimbursed. But yeah, answering the question, you really do have to work out why they're not coming to work, and then you can deal with it from there.
So as long as they're an employee, Jonathan, and we're paying them, then we'll get JobKeeper. But if they cease to be an employee because of some sort of alleged breach by them of not following a reasonable direction, and you terminate them, only then will the JobKeeper.
That's when the job seeker would apply. Yeah. So there's two types: JobKeeper, job seeker. Yes.
I have another question via the Q&A from Elsa. How are you, Elsa? Good to hear from you. How long can you be stood down before your role is made redundant in this current environment?
Yeah, look, that's an excellent question. And look, I would have thought that if you go back to basics, obviously stood down is just suspending the employment, and most people obviously are going to be looking no more at 6 months. Redundancy, on the other hand, though, is if you go back to the definitions where the role is no longer required to be done by anyone due to economic, technology type of reasons. So it is obviously two different scenarios. There is no hard and fast rule. I would have thought most people have been stood down and it's for no more than 6 months until the employer can try and get business back as usual. That being said, if the role is being made redundant, there's no suitable positions in the organisation, consultation is required. Well, then that's it. As John says, you're actually no longer an employee, and so that means that you're obviously not eligible for JobKeeper. most people were stood down and now they're being paid so that they can get the JobKeeper payment. Yes, that's right.
So if you're on a stand down and your company decides during that time to do a review, restructure, rethink about what it is and what services provides, and then you're made redundant, are they able to do that?
Well, it comes back down to the genuine redundancy test, absolutely. So, and we are getting some litigation coming through on that. So we've got a case at the moment where someone was made redundant and that kind of wasn't a genuine redundancy. So as long as it's a genuine redundancy, is not an issue.
And General, just your thoughts that I read with notice you're working from home, kind of suggestions around policies. Wonder how many of us are adhering to those as we rapidly moved pretty quickly to work from home. I know I'm working from a small desk and a card table sometimes, but you know, it's really interesting, and I think as we probably phase back our workforces, so we're not all just going to arrive back to work at once. What do you think we probably need to think of as perhaps our workforces don't maybe want to work the way we used to in the past? How do you think we need to transition as a business? Should we be developing COVID-19 plans for that transition within our workforce? Just some thoughts would be interesting.
Look, I think working from home became a very quick agenda item with everyone needing to put that in place. And Jonathan, you know, I'm sure he can talk to more of this though, that as employers, we still need to make sure our people are in a safe workplace, whether at home or elsewhere. And I know, for example, when I had to move to work from home for a period, I had a 4-page assessment that I had to complete to make sure my work from home arrangements were safe. So I think there's going to be some huge ramifications around that. I would have thought, Jonathan, to make sure that wherever people are working, whether it's in and out of the office, coming in and out of the office, hot desking, from home, from somewhere else, that there's going to be a need to ensure that all of those workplaces are safe and that people can get their work done as they need to. From a property perspective, you know, it's been spoken about a lot that, you know, the big office buildings here in the city, for example, may end up empty. Let's be silly about it, because people have realised you can work from home and work more flexibly. My thinking on that though is it may be the case that people have less, or businesses have less people in these sorts of office environments, but in the last 5 years particularly, we've seen a real intensification of use. So we've seen a lot more people in smaller spaces. I think what this pandemic has probably demonstrated is having people that close to each other is maybe not a good thing. And so I think what we'll see is, whilst there may be less a need for less people in the office, there'll be a de-intensification of use, which will mean perhaps the same amount of space or a large degree of that space will still be needed to fit in those people. So I'm not, and maybe it's the optimist in me, I'm not as convinced that we're going to have empty office buildings, but I think we will see a de-intensification of use and also a decentralisation, where we may see, you know, businesses move to city fringe if they need to. They may look at areas like airport as a better option because it's you know, maybe more centrally accessible, or we may see a move to cheaper premises where you get more bang for your buck. From a retail perspective, everyone's talking about online sales and how that's taken off because people have changed their shopping habits and those sorts of things. Australia is such a large country that this concept that everyone's going to be able to move to online sales tomorrow and shops are going to be able to service it, or retailers are going to be able to service it in warehouses, I don't think is necessarily sensible. We haven't seen Amazon take off here the way we expected. The sole reason being they can't set up their supply chain where they're able to easily service the whole country. So I think shopping centres are most definitely going to have to pivot, which seems to be the word of the day at the moment, they're going to have to pivot into different offerings, I think we'll still see quite a number of traditional bricks and mortar type retail operations, if nothing else, to enable that supply chain to continue for those online staff.
Right, we've got two questions coming online, which I'd like to get to in our last few minutes, if we could. So there's one from Toby. Hi, John. For clarity, is an Australian Pty Ltd company that is ultimately owned overseas with a turnover under 50 million caught by the code?
We believe not, Toby, to answer that question. So we believe the code does not apply to them. But looking at it equitably, looking at the vibe, if they legitimately need some help, then going back to my last comment about being sensible and looking at something that's mutually sustainable, then you would give the help. If, however, they don't need the help and they're just taking the mickey, then you're well within your rights to tell them to go away.
Okay, great. And from Bernie, we have one. When staff are stood down or on reduced hours, are they still entitled to accrue their full annual leave entitlements, or is it pro rata to their actual worked hours? Can companies also enforce annual leave on their staff during this crisis? Good question.
Yeah, good question. Well, there's two questions there. So I think when you said when staff are stood down or put on reduced hours, so commonly we're finding that people have been put down on three days a week. So 3 out of 5 days, which is 3/5. So yes, you do accrue going forward your leave at 3/5 of what you were before. So you might have accrued up to that date, 2 weeks, and then from that date on, you're accruing 3/5. So you're not going to lose your entitlements. We're finding same with long service leave. Not going to lose any entitlements. It's just accruing at a slower rate. And then the last question is, can companies enforce annual leave? Yeah, this really is a specific question. There's obviously different types of awards and points in employment contracts and policies. But the answer is, in some circumstances, yes, you can direct people to take leave. Absolutely.
Just a quick one, Jonathan. Have employees been generally understanding of the challenges that are facing their employers in terms of reduced hours, reduced salary or wages? What's been the general consensus among the employee groups?
Yeah, look, Doug, that's an excellent question. It really comes down to different types. For instance, some industries, some employees in sort of, say, the public sector haven't really been affected as much as others, but we're finding in at least the private sector, people understand that, people are very understanding. So people acknowledge that, yes, no one wants to go down to 3 days a week out of 5. But at the end of the day, it's better than having 0 days. And we're really finding that people understand that they want to get through with the business to the other end. Unfortunately, there is one or two, but on the whole, we're finding that people much prefer 3 days a week than 0.
Yeah, and for those that have been stood down or are working for businesses that have been forced to close, the JobKeeper program seems to be giving those affected employees a degree of comfort. So until that was announced, I think there was a lot more angst out there, but as soon as that was announced, and we're now starting to see it flow through, employees in those affected areas seem to be a lot less anxious about what's going on.
Do you think the JobKeeper program is likely, and this is for all three of you actually, including Rebecca, do you think that the JobKeeper program will likely be extended out beyond September?
Good question. I think it depends on where we are at that time. As we've got many businesses saying that they think there'll be a slowdown and it will need to be extended. We certainly lobbied really hard for the JobKeeper program or wage subsidy, and are very supportive and continue to put thoughts forward as to how long it should go. So I think nothing is off the table. I think if our economy is still, like I said, we've had a slowdown in other sectors, and it's still required because contracts have dried out, construction might be slower. I think it'll be reviewed closer to the date, and if needed, would have to be extended. And we'd certainly support that if that's what business and industry are telling us.
Yep.
Yeah, from my point of view, I think obviously 130 billion is a lot of money. Things are changing daily, hourly out there. Look, from my point of view, everything so far is 6 months. It's geared to end at 6 months. And what I'm hearing obviously is we're doing really well from the virus point of view, but a lot of clients are wanting to see more of that economic uptick. So I don't know. I would have thought at the moment we're telling people yes, 6 months, but everything's up in the air.
Right. Well, look, we've hit 1 p.m. So we're going to wrap it up now. I don't think there are any other questions that are coming through. I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank yourself, Rebecca, Jonathan, and John for your time this afternoon. We've thoroughly appreciated the insights that you've been able to provide to us. Just as a word for our members who are in on the webinar this afternoon, the team at Gadens are free for initial complimentary introductory meetings with our members. They'll be sending emails out to all participants in the next 24 to 48 hours just to touch base and see if there's any assistance you might need. I imagine, Rebecca, the same applies for the team at AI Group. I think there's a tremendous amount of resources available through the AI Group team, and we're incredibly thankful to be able to tap into that brains trust that you have at AI Group. So thank you very much, all three of you, for attending the webinar. Letting everyone know the next webinar will be taking place in late May. It will be focused on communications as well as human resourcing. We'll be letting people know who those guest speakers are over the next week or so. And please, if anyone's got any suggestions about upcoming webinars, please email me at info@bneenterprise.com for any suggestions you want to put forward. We may, in fact, have the team from Gadens back. You guys have been tremendous. Thank you so much for taking us through the ins and outs of your respective subject areas this afternoon, gentlemen. If anyone's, please, I wish we could all clap. Just so you all know too, by the way, that Rebecca and I are actually doing this webinar from the same building. However, our social distancing is more than appropriate. We're about 25 metres away from one another. So maybe we might actually see the occupancy rates start to improve, guys, if more people are going to be that spaced out. Businesses with one level might need 6. You never know.
Indeed.
All right, guys, thanks very much for everybody's time. Really appreciate it, and we'll catch up soon. Cheers.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everyone.
See you guys. Bye.